So we're on Daf Tzadi, and we have a little piece that really belongs to yesterday's Daf. We'll try to just quickly finish that so we could start really the main sugya for today's Daf. And the Gemara is talking about the question as to whether at what point in time the sinews will develop after the Avarim. And we're talking about Gidin, which are sinews. And if we assume that the Gidin develop later on after the Avarim, so that would mean that the Isur Hano from Kodshim comes before the Gid Anosha prohibition. And the Gemara presents that as a contradiction to what we've been assuming until now, that with regard to the fetus, both the Isur of Hano from Kodshim and the Isur of Gid Anosha emerge simultaneously. So at this point, the Gemara is going to say that Enoch Hinami, you're right. I have to concede that the Gidin develop later after the Avarim, but nevertheless, even so, the Isur Gid Anosha will be Chal on top of the Isur Hanomi Kodshim, which was already Chal when the limbs, the Avarim developed. And even though we have a rule of Ein Isur Chal Isur, we have an exception to that rule. Afal Gav the Isur Mukdoshim Kodem, Osi Isur Gid Chaylale Shekain Isurei Noeg B'Bnei Noach. We have a principle called an Isur Mosif, that if the second Isur adds in its scope to the first Isur, then there's room for it to be Chal, even subsequent to the first Isur. And in this case, the Isur of Gid Anosha expands the scope beyond that of the Isur Hanomi Kodshim, because the Isur Hanomi from Kodshim is part of the Isurim that are given to the Jewish people, but Gid Anosha is given not only to the Jewish people, but also to the non-Jewish people. That's the opinion that the Gemara is suggesting. It all depends upon the status of Yaakov Avinu when he was battling against the Malach. And if we assume that Yaakov Avinu had the status of a Ben Noach because it was before Matan Torah, therefore we see that the Gid Anosha prohibition applies even to Ben Noach, and that makes it into an Isur Mosif. It's more stringent than the Isur of Hanomi Kodshim, and therefore be Chal. And therefore we could explain our Mishnah that postulates that the Isur of Gid Anosha applies even to Kodshim. But the Gemara has a problem now. Why? Because Man Shamet Leilas, which Tana is of the opinion that the Isur Gid Anosha applies even to Bnei Noach? Rabbi Yehuda. It happens to be Rabbi Yehuda, which we'll have later on about 10 blot down the line. And the Mishnah on Daf Kuf presents a machlokes as to whether Gid Anosha applies even to a non-kosher animal, and that if we assume that yesh begidin b'nosein tam, then the tam of the gid of a non-kosher animal is equivalent to the meat of a non-kosher animal. Now, the prohibition of the Isur of non-kosher meat will emerge as soon as the fetus forms. The Gid Anosha prohibition does not come until later when the Gidin, like the Gid Anosha, develop. And yet, according to Tanakama, the Gid Anosha cannot take effect on the pre-existing prohibition of non-kosher meat. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees And his opinion is that the Gid Anosha does take effect on non-kosher meat. Why? Because it's an Isur Chamur insofar as it applies even to Bnei Noach. And we've already proved that our Mishnah is against Rabbi Yehuda because our Mishnah presents a machlokes as to whether or not both thighs, the right thigh and the left, both are prohibited under Gid Anosha. V'maslisin delok Rabbi Yehuda. Our Mishnah does not reflect the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, the Ketani Noig Bebehema Ubechaya, that Gid Anosha applies to Behema Bechaya B'Yerech Shel Yamin B'Yerech Shel Smol. And Rabbi Yehuda holds, we're going to have a whole sugi about that today, that the Isur Gid Anosha only applies to one thigh and not to the other. And the question is whether it's the right thigh, B'Toras Vadai, or the right thigh, B'Toras Suffolk. That's going to be the sugi for today. So, in a sense, we are accepting Rabbi Yehuda's shita that the Isur of Gid Anosha is more chamur than the Isur of Mukdashim, and therefore it's chal on top, piggybacked on top of the Isur Mukdashim. And that's going to explain our Mishnah that Gid Anosha applies even to Mukdashim, but yet our Mishnah clearly is not like Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara is going to give the answer, which we could already anticipate on our own. In other words, the author of our Mishnah accepts the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, but only with regard to the applicability of Gid Anosha to non-Jews, but rejects Rabbi Yehuda's Shita as far as the one thigh limitation rule of Rabbi Yehuda, and our Mishnah is of the opinion that Gid Anosha applies to both thighs. So that's not a problem. And we can make a consistent shita in our Mishnah if we accept Rabbi Yehuda with regard to one halacha, even though we reject it with regard to another halacha. The Gemara now raised the following objection. Eimer d'shamet leil Rabbi Yehuda. When do we find that Rabbi Yehuda would add the Isur of Gid Anosha on top of non-kosher meat? That's only b'tmeya. That's only with regard to the Isur of non-kosher that takes effect on top of the Isur of Gid Anosha. So we're talking about a non-kosher animal and its gid, and we're assuming that the gid has tam. And now we want to know whether or not, in addition to the Isur of non-kosher animal, we could also add the Isur of Gid Anosha, insofar as it's an Isur Chamur, an Isur Mosif, it adds Bnei Noach. That's where Rabbi Yehuda is committed on Daf Kuf to that position, because it's an Isur Lav. In other words, when you're talking about non-kosher meat, then you're talking about an Isur Lav. There's no Chiyuv Kares. It's not on that level. Gid Anosha is also an Isur Lav. And Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that even though the Isur of non-kosher applies to the fetus in its mother's womb before the development of the Gidim, once the limbs are developed, nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda holds that on top of the Isur of non-kosher, we can add the Isur of Gid Anosha, because it applies even to Bnei Noach. However, says the Gemara, Kodshim the Isur Kares mishamet le. How do we know that Rabbi Yehuda would maintain the position that we can add on top of the Isur Kodshim an Isur Gid Anosha? Although when I put it on the scale, I know that the Isur Gid Anosha is more chomer in the fact that it applies to a non-Jew. whereas Mukdashim doesn't. But on the other hand, on the same scale, I have to point out that Gidanosh is only a lav without a chiv kares, whereas Mukdashim is an Isur kares. And therefore, in such a case, since the Isur of Mukdashim emerged before the Isur of Gidanosh, when the limbs were formed, even before the sinews were formed, and that Isur is an Isur kares, Rabbi Yehuda presumably would agree and admit that the Isur Gidanosh would not be chal. So accepting that sheet is not going to get you out of the plunter of trying to figure out why our Mishnah establishes that the Isur Gidanosh applies even to Kodshim. Elahacha, since the Gemara has now been convinced that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Isur Gidanosh could not be chal on Kodshim because Kodshim is so chamor that it generates an Isur kares. And we're going according to the sugi that we saw yesterday, that our Mishnah, we had a vacillation whether our Mishnah was referring to the Vlad of Kodshim. So now the Gemara comes up with a whole new understanding of our Mishnah. When the Mishnah says that Gidanosh applies even to Kodshim, it's b'mvakeres askinon. We're talking about Kedushas Bechor, Deberechem Kadosh. Already, when the Bechor is in its mother's womb, it's already considered Kadosh, B'Kedushas Bechor, which has to be brought on the Mizbeach. And yet, even though the Bechor is Kadosh Mirechem Imo, nevertheless, the Isur Gidanosh would apply. Because the Isur Gidanosh applies even to a fetus, as we saw in the Shita Tanakama of our Mishnah. And the Isur, although the Kedusha of the Bechor might be chal already at the beginning stage, but the din of Kodshim, with the Isur Kodshim, is only chal when the Vlad is born. And that's what the Pasuk says, Ki voled b'cha, after it's born. So the Isur Gidanosh will be chal as soon as we pass the stage of the limbs, and we got into the stage of the sinews, and the fetus already is also b'Gidanosh, and then later on, the Bechor, with its Isur of Kodshim, is only going to be chal with birth. And that explains why the Isur Gidanosh will be chal, and the Isur Kodshim will be chal on top of the Gidanosh for any number of reasons. Iboy Sema, Vlados, Kodshim, Bavayasan, Hein Kdoshin. Now the Gemara is going back to its original understanding that the Mishnah is talking about Vlados Kodshim, but our Mishnah maintains the position that even a Vlad of Kodshim only becomes Kodesh and generates an Isur Hana from Kodshim with the birth, but not before the birth. And that, by the way, is a machlokes Tanoim as to when Vlados Kodshim become prohibited as Kodshim. And it all depends upon Ba'avayosan Hein Kdoshim. Right? The Pasuk says, Rak Doshecha Asher Yu Lecha. And that's an allusion to the later stage that the offspring of Kodshim is only consecrated at a later stage. Okay. Now, Rabbosai, that was a hashlama of yesterday's daf. Now we start today's daf. And we're really getting into heavy kodshim. We're going to be talking about the following topics. Number one, ola, a carbon ola. And with regard to carbon ola, we have to get into the question, which parts of the actual, let's say, for example, olas tamid, which is a lamb, are going to be brought on the Mizbeach, which parts are going to be burnt on the Mizbeach, which parts have to be taken off the Mizbeach, so that now, although the name of the Masechta is Chullin, we're going to learn Kodshim. I didn't write the script. Amar Rab Chia bar Yosef. You've told me now in our Mishnah that the Isa Gid Anosha applies to Kodshim. Lo shanu ela Kodshim hanecholim. Aval Kodshim she'enim cholim ein Isa Gid noeg bahem. Okay. Now, there are two types of Kodshim. There's, on the one hand, Shlomim, Tatos, and Asham. They are Necholim. In the case of Shlomim, the Bailim, who are not Kohanim, can eat the Barsa Shlomim all over the city. In the case of Chatos and Asham, it's only eaten by the Zichrei Kahuna and only in the Azara. And then we have a Korban Olah. Korban Olah is Kulo Kolil, and nothing is Necha. The only achila that applies to Olah is what's called achilas mizbeach, meaning you burn it on top of the mizbeach. And now the question is, when the Mishnah says that there's an Isur Gid Anosha on Kodshim, does that apply to all Kodshim? Says Reb Chia, no. It doesn't apply to all Kodshim. It only applies to a Korban Olah. I'm sorry. It only applies to Kodshim HaNecholim, which means Shlomim, Chatos, and Asham. Aval Kodshim she'enim Necholim, which refers to Olah, that's completely Kolil, is Ein Isur Gid Noeg Bahem. There's no Isur Gid that applies to them. That's the Shita of Reb Chia. We have to write this on the whiteboard, because Reb Yochanan disagrees, and he holds Echad Kodshim Necholim V'Echad Kodshim she'enam Necholim Isur Noeg, Isur Gid Noeg. The Isur of Gid Anosha applies even to Kodshim which are Einam Necholim, meaning even to a Korban Olah. So we have Machlokas now whether or not Gid Anosha applies to a Korban Olah. According to Reb Chia, yes. I'm sorry. According to Reb Chia, no. There's no Gid Anosha in Olah. According to Rabbi Yochanan, yes. Even in the case of Olah, there's an Isur Gid Anosha. What's this all about? Omer of Papa lo pligi. Kan lehal koso and kan lehal loso. Rabbi Yochanan is not talking about what gets burnt on the Mizbeach. Rabbi Yochanan is talking about if someone violates the Isur Achila and goes ahead and he eats the Gid Anosha. With regard to that, there's no machlokas. You're going to get malchus for eating Gid Anosha, and it doesn't matter whether it came from this Kodshim, meaning Shlomim, or it came from this Kodshim, meaning Olah. What did Reb Chia bar Rav Yosef have in mind when he differentiated between the two categories of Kodshim? He was talking about lahaloso. What do we do with Gid Anosha on top of the Mizbeach? Do we burn it or do we not burn it? Again, you have to ask a different question. What about sinews in general, whether all Gidin are burnt on the Mizbeach? So that's going to have to first be addressed. But let's assume, for argument's sake now, that all Gidin are burnt together with the basar, together with the chalavim on the Mizbeach. What about the status of Gid Anosha? Is it to be burnt or not? Now, keep in mind, the Gemara is going to distinguish between two cases. Case number one, where the Gid Anosha is still inside the yerech, it's in the thigh. And case number two, where you've already removed the Gid Anosha from the thigh, and then you'd be burning the Gid Anosha in and of itself. But right now we have Rav Papa, and Rav Papa is telling us that there's no machlokus between Reb Chia and Reb Yochanan, and basically for our purposes, even Reb Yochanan agrees to Reb Chia that as far as burning a Gid Anosha on the Mizbeach, you could only burn the Gid Anosha on the Mizbeach if it's a carbon shlamim. But not if it's a carbon oil. Now, what we have to know is the following. Reb Chia bar Abba, I'm sorry, bar Reb Yosef, is going to try to prove to us that when the Torah prohibits Gida Noshe, that's only for human consumption. That's only the Bnei Yisrael. Because the Pasuk says, Al Kain lo yochlu Bnei Yisrael es Gida Noshe. Bnei Yisrael are not allowed to eat the Gida Noshe. But there's another Achila, which is excluded from this Pasuk, and that's the Achila of the Mizbeach. So when it comes to burning the Gida Noshe on the Mizbeach, that's not a problem. Why isn't it a problem? Because the Torah prohibits Gida Noshe for Achilas Adam, otherwise known as Achilas Hejot, but not for Achilas Mizbeach. The exception to that rule is going to be the carbon ola. Because again, in the case of a carbon ola, we're going to have to see and analyze what parts of the lamb are actually burnt on the Mizbeach. Ika Diamri, again, another transmission attributed to Rav Papa, in which Rav Papa says there's no machlokus between Rav Chia and Rav Yochanan. Lo pligi kan lecholzo v'kan la'aloso. So let's understand. Lecholzo means to remove the Gida Noshe from the erech. When Reb Chia bar Yosef tells us that with regard to the Gida Noshe of a carbon ola, lecholzo, we have to remove it from the erech. V'kan la'aloso, meaning if you remove the Gida Noshe from the erech, just 1 second. Okay, I have a certain problem here because of what comes up around the bend, but let's hope, Be'ezer Hashem, that problem will be resolved. But I'm just going to give pshat now as I see it here. The Gemara is going to say the following, that if you are burning on the Mizbeach, the Gid Anoshe, as part of the Yerech, that's okay. So Reb Chia, when he said that in the case of a carbon ola, you have to prohibit the gid anosha on the mizbeach. What he was basically saying is you've got to remove the gid anosha from the erev. When Reb Chia said that when Reb Yochanan said that there's no problem in burning it on the mizbeach, he was talking about when you bring onto the mizbeach the yerech together with the gid anosha in its place. Okay, so all this is Roman numeral number 1, and that's Rav Papa, to work it out so that there's no machlokas between Reb Chia and Reb Yochanan. Now we get to Roman numeral number 2, and that's Reb Nachman Bar Yitzchak. He first of all rejects Rav Papa, who assumed that there's no machlokas between Reb Chia and Reb Yochanan, but rather, according to Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, there is a machlokas. And the question is, can you bring onto the Mizbeach the Yerech together with the Gid Anosha inside the Yerech? And that's called La Loso Pligi. Is there an obligation to remove the Gid Anosha from the Yerech? The Yerech has to be burnt on the Mizbeach. There's Haktorah. But the question is, do we have to remove the Gid Anosha in the case of a carbon ola? And here's where Reb Chia says, yes, we have to remove it. And Reb Yochanan says, you know what? Since you have a Haktorah of the Yerech, you can leave the Gid Anosha inside the Yerech and burn the Gid Anosha together with the Yerech. Okay, now we're going to require a learning of not one brisa, but 2 brisos, which are going to present a machlokas between the Tanakama and Rebbe. And after we go through these 2 brisos, we're going to try to substantiate what Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak is saying, that in effect the machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim in the 2 brisos that we're about to learn bears on the machlokas between Reb Yochanan and Reb Chia as to whether or not you have to remove the Gid Anosha from the kaf, from the erech of the carbon ola before you burn the erech on the mizbeh. Disanya, we learned in a brisa. Now, this brisa is going to address the following question. We know that a carbon ola is kulo kolil, completely burnt on the mizbeach. What do we put on the mizbeach? There are many different parts to the lamb. And the pasuk starts with a ribui. The ribui is vehiktir hakon es hakol hamizbecha. Hakol means every single part of the lamb. L'rabos, this includes atzamos gidin karnaim and tlofim, meaning horns, sinews, bones, hooves, everything. Now again, you can ask whether that is limited to a case where the lamb is whole, or even if you took off the horns or the sinews or the bones or the hooves and they were removed from the rest of the lamb, and now that you have to burn them separately, independently. You might say that even if you took away the horns, the sinews, etc., and you separated from the lamb, you still burn those parts on the Mizbeach. Talmud Lomer, now we have a miut. The asisa olasecha habasar vadam. What should be burnt on the Mizbeach? Only basar and dam, right? We need the dam for zrik al gabi mizbeach. That's the ikar mechaper of the carbon. And the meat, which includes the chalavim and ivarim, that has to be burnt on the mizbeach, but not the gidin at samos karnayim and tlofim. So we have now, in a sense, a contradiction. On the one hand, we have a ribuy of hakol. On the other hand, we have a mute basar v'dam, but not the rest, the horns, the bones, the sinews, and the hooves. E basar v'dam. Well, if you're going to take the miyut to its logical conclusion, then you got to get rid of the sinews and the bones, remove them from the lamb before you put the lamb on the mizbeach. Yachlotz gidin vatzamos. V'yalad basa l'gav mizbeach. Only basa is going to go on the mizbeach. Tamid lomar. We have now the ribui. We go back to the ribui, and the ribui says v'hikdar konis hakol on mizbeach. So how do we reconcile this contradiction? And the answer is depends whether or not the sinews and the bones and the horns and the hooves are part of the lamb, and you're going to put the whole lamb on the mizbech, or they were separated. Mechubarim yalu, as long as they're attached to the meat of the carbanola, let them go on the mizbech and be burnt. Parshu, but if you took them away, then don't put them on the mizbech. And now the Brisa adds another point. Afilu barosha shel mizbech yerdu, right? We have a principle called him olu lo yerdu in kodshim, that even though certain things are not meant and designated to be burnt on the mizbech, once you put it on the mizbech, then you burn it. But in this case, since the hooves and the sinews and the horns and the bones were separated from the olah, if you brought them up on the mizbech, bring them down. Okay. So that's Brisa number one. Now, what we're going to continue now with another Brisa in just a minute is to present the machlokas between Rebbe and the Chacham. Mantana de Shamet Lei, who's the author of this first Brisa, who holds the position that the Omer Parshu Yeredu, that with regard to these addendums, if they went up on the Mizbech, they have to be taken down from the Mizbech because they went up separately. That's Rebbe. And now we introduce the Machlokes Shin Chachamim and Rebbe in the second Brisa. The Sanya we learned in the second Brisa. V'hikter HaKones HaKol l'Rabos HaTzomos v'Gidin v'Karnayim v'Tlof Afilu Pershu. Now that opinion we didn't have in the first price. Afilu Pershu. But once you have the ribui of Hakol, then it matters not whether it's part of the lamb or not part of the lamb. Everything in the lamb has to be brought on the Mizbeach. But Hamani Nukayim Vasisa Olosecha Bosav Adam, we have a mute. That's a different story. This is the Chachamim of Rebbe that hold that even if these hooves and bones and sinews were removed from the lamb and separated, you still bring them up on the Mizbeach. But where does the Torah mamait? Where's the mute? That's called in Piyah. Bipokin. Now, this has nothing to do with poking. We're not poking anything here. But what does poking mean? Poking means that sometimes when the fire is very heavy, burning up the chalavim and the ivarim of the carbon, then things start like bursting out. Poking means bursting. And they like sort of, they explode. And they end up off the mizbeach. Haketzad ikule basar atom machzir, the atom machzir ikule gidin vatzamos. So if, let's say, the gidin atzamos and the karnayim and the tlofim were partially burnt on the mizbeach, but now in that state of partial burning, they were pokim, right? They burst forth and they exploded off the Mizbeach, then Iatamach. So you don't put it back on the Mizbeach. But that's only pokim. As far as burning them on the Mizbeach, with the exception of pokim where they got burst off the Mizbeach, then you burn them on the Mizbeach. And even in the case of Parish, that's the Chacham. Whereas we saw in the previous brisa that Rebbe maintains that as a separate entity, if it was cut off from the lamb, you do not burn the hooves and bones and sinews. And not only that, if you brought it up to Mizbeach, you got to take it down. Rebbe Omer, Kosevech Omer, he learns the psukim differently. Hikter Kones Hakol Ribo. Kosevech Omer, Asisolos, Obosamit. Haketzad, how do we resolve the ribui with the miut? Mechubarim Yalu. If the bones and the sinews and the hooves and the horns were still attached to the animal, that's called mechubarim ya'alu. Then you burn them on the mizbeach together with the whole lamb. But parshu, if they're no longer mechubarim, they were separated, is then number one, you don't bring them up on the mizbeach, and number two, if you did bring them up to the Mizbeach, you have to take them down from the Mizbeach. Afilu berosha shel Mizbeach yerd. In any event, we see clearly from Rebbe Shita that we always differentiate between parts of the lamb that are still attached to the body and those parts that were separated from the body. In which case, if we apply that sheet of Rebbe and the machlokes between Rebbe and the Chachamim to the case of Gid Anoshe, then you might say the following, that Rebbe would allow you to burn the Yerech with the Gid Anoshe inside of it on the Mizbeach, but not when it was separated from the Yerech. And that is the support for Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, who says, La'aloso pligi, which means that Reb Chia and Reb Yochanan disagree in a case where the Gid Anoshe was left inside the Yerech, whether you bring it up on the Mizbeach. And we're going to analyze that machlokas. Rabbanan, right? The Rabbanan say that even Pirshu, right? Let's go over it one more time. What did the Rabbanan say? Atzamas v'gid nafilu Pirshu, etc. From now on, I'm just going to make it simpler and say atzomos, and you'll know it means the bones, right? So wait a minute. Why not assume that the ribui of the pasuk here for the bones, etc., that's only if it's still inside the olah? Says, say the Chachamim, mechubarim lo itzur kroler b'yibi dehavi arosha shel olah. The rush, the head of the olah, is burned together with the rest of the body of the olah, even though it's full of bones. So therefore, mechubarim lo itzur. I don't need to know from the Torah a special ribui that the bones of the lamb are burnt on the mizbeach as long as they're mechubarim. If they're mechubarim, it's not worse than the rush. And therefore, ki yitzur kra, if the pasuk is adding kol to teach you a ribui, then it's referring to Pirshu, even though the bones were separated from the body. For Rebbe, so according to Rebbe, what's he going to do with the logic, the compelling logic of the Rabbanan, who argue that Mechubarim doesn't need a ribui because you have Rosho Shel Olah? Says Rebbe, don't prove anything from Rosho Shel Ola. I want to know about the Gid Anasha. The Rosho Shel Ola is Mechubarim Dehetera. I don't need a ribui to be marbe the bones and the sinews and the hooves that are hetera. Anyone's allowed to eat them. But rather on the top here of Tzadi Amid Beis, lo itzur kra l'rabuyik itzur kra l'gid anasha b'mechuba. I need a pasuk to allow me to take the yerech of the carbanola and put the entire yerek in its entirety onto the mizbeach, including the gid anasha that's inside of it. That's the ribui. Once you separate it, then not only is it excluded from going onto the mizbeach, if it went on to the mizbeach, we have to take it down from the mizbeach.